How's everybody doing? You had good lunch? Yeah. I guess you're all like now tired. It's always like after lunch, everybody eats so much and says, oh, I hope the next session is good, otherwise I fall asleep. I'll try to do my best, so let's see what we can make. But otherwise, I say lean back, enjoy the view. And yeah, like today I'm going to talk a little bit about Vue, and it's very often referenced as the progressive framework. And always one of the first questions I hear is like, okay, why is it progressive? Like, what makes it progressive compared to other things? And I think that's a fair question. On the one side or so, progressive just sounds super cool. Like progressive enhancement is like, it makes a lot of sense, basically. We try to progress our way through it. And it's the same with Vue. Vue tries to help you progress kind of through the whole kind of Vue tech stack. And I would like to break it down in this way, where say, our path is kind of like to progress our way into the Vue world, learn more about it, and I would say there's a level of mastery necessary every now and then. So in the beginning, you don't know a lot about a framework when you start out with it, but it's your first results, and you don't need to know a lot or so actually to get your first cool results. But then you want to use components, you want to use like Webpack, all this kind of stuff. Like you progress your way through it, and as you do this, you learn a lot about the framework, and you yourself, like you get better and better at doing it. So yeah, I was introduced briefly. I'm Roman Kuba. I come from Austria, and you can find me a lot on Twitter on @CodeBrio, and also at our company @CodeShip. And yeah, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter for any questions, anything you have maybe afterwards. And I'm also going to post my slides there, so if you want to follow me, I would appreciate it and be happy about it. But yeah, why am I talking to you about Vue today? That's also a fair question. I'm not trying just to say, okay, oh, it's a cool tech I found or so I want to do. Okay, for me, there's like a lot of like passion into it and kind of a lot of history actually. And we started using Vue at our company in production about over 3 years ago when it was kind of 0.11. So there was no version 1, and it was like very much the underdog in the whole ecosystem by then. There were a lot of reasons why we did it, and I just say it was a very hard fight to get it done at first or so, but yeah, tell me, why did we actually kind of end up choosing Vue over anything else? And I think from a history standpoint, we had like one problem with our application. There was one page, we had to render a shitload of DOM nodes, so over 100K, like a lot of like front-end rendering. We need to parse logs from base64, colorize them, a lot of things were going on, and we're using Angular 1 back then in our tech stack. And it just like, it crashed. And I personally come from Angular 1 background, so I don't try to kind of smack talk it. I really loved it, but we had no way of kind of getting to the performance that we were looking for. And the problem is with the crashes, we're a SaaS product and our customers use us on a daily basis. And if their tabs crash on certain pages, that's not a great experience you want to be in. So we said, okay, we have to fix this. We have to do something now. We were a small startup back then, actually, like about 20 people max. And most of them were actually marketing and sales, so engineering was very, very small by then. And we had a lot of time constraints, of course, because customers were waiting, okay, show me something, I want this to work again. We had limited knowledge in something else, because I, as said, come from Angular 1 background. And with resources, it was also basically only me being front-end developer at the company by then. So I started to look at various different kind of options back then. We say, okay, let's take 1 week aside and do some good research. What we're going to do, what we're going to choose for our kind of to get us out of this mess. And in this week, I said, okay, I'm going to look at React, having like, this is like the big thing everybody tells you, use React, this is what you need to do eventually. And I also heard about Vue very briefly. But I had like very limited knowledge on both of them. So I said, okay, I use 1 week and try to learn and see if there's one thing that I think we should kind of invest in as a company. And the one thing that struck me about Vue, like super on, is like the narrative coherence that I kind of stumbled over. What this means like is that the documentation was really, really good. It kind of like helped me to ease in. And like when you learn something from scratch and like you have not a lot of knowledge, and React back then was just like a very technical API, but you don't understand like the whole principles behind it, Vue did like the perfect way of easing you in, explaining you how to do the things, and that's cool. Like I learned a lot of things and I was able to kind of do a prototype like after 2 days that kind of like was mimicking what we had back then or so, like was solving a lot of issues. And yeah, that's kind of like made me use it. And the word narrative coherence, I like to call because it makes me like sound smart, and like I also like the term, like it's cool, it's kind of a representation of what the story actually wants to be. So the other frameworks that I kind of faced very often was, okay, like at one point you say, okay, there's the framework, and as soon as I learned it, at one point I want to do like state management, because like, of course, my application gets more complex. Maybe I want to do routing if I go down the SPA approach. And very often this is like this very kind of like tricky path. You need to navigate your way around it. And if you don't know the ecosystem around it, it's like super hard to find your path. So it like takes a lot of time in researching and getting there and knowing, am I choosing the right tool? Like 10 different blogs suggest like 10 different solutions. Like what should I do? What's the right one? And for Vue, this was actually, if I tried to do the same story there, it was like super much like one straight line. It took me from start to finish. Like once you have your framework, that's Vue. Once you reach state management, there's like Vuex waiting for you. And once you want to do routing, there's like Vue router waiting for you. Like it's all baked into the system and tells you, okay, like once ever you kind of like, you progress your way through it, those are the tools ready for you to use. And along the path, you can then start to kind of put in everything on top that you like, that you need in your project, but nothing is forced on top of you. So you have like all the freedom. And I see the faces now, they're all like, okay, where's finally the code? Like there was a lot of talking and no code so far. Okay, so here's some code. That's the simplest hello world example for Vue, just to see, okay, like, is it that easy or so? Yes, it is. In this case, it's like really just in a markup, drop it in. We use the script tag. In this case, for unpackage, we just kind of reference the file there, and then we kind of use our script, and we're already able to print something out of our Vue framework. Okay, that's cool, but that's not a super powerful use case. So one thing I also did extensively in my career was like writing jQuery code. Like at this point, I have to say, like I really loved jQuery for what it brought to the table. Like the adoption jQuery phase at one point, I think it was like on 80% of all web pages, like there was some kind of jQuery code running at one point. Which like, that's crazy, that's amazing. And like React and Vue, not sure if they will ever kind of reach this point again, what jQuery did, but like opened up development because it made like forging great experiences with like just JavaScript code, like super, super easy and comfortable. And one super, super simple example that I kind of did over and over and over again with jQuery was, okay, for example, I click on something and then when I trigger certain methods, do anything. And with jQuery, this is very much, okay, I can bind it anywhere in the DOM. It's kind of like in my kind of HTML markup. And then I have like my JavaScript and it all reacts together. And I think, okay, I want something that's as simple and as powerful. And luckily with Vue, that was that easy actually. I just was able to say, okay, like I use this v-on-click parameter, what maybe also looks familiar if you come from an Angular background, and I personally did at this point. So I think, okay, that looks cool, that's nice, that's easy to digest. And I just needed to know there's like this magic object called methods. And as soon as you put anything in the methods, it's like your function that you can invoke from anywhere. So that was nice. And the other thing that I like about Vue is like we see this v-on-click and just come to the point, imagine, okay, I have maybe a lot of events going on my pages, and this v-on is everywhere. That might be annoying. Like Vue tries to make this like nice and developer-friendly again, so you can just write @ instead of the v-on colon. So that's nice as well, and it works exactly the same way. But the other example that I also had to do in jQuery, and I guess like not a single person who ever wrote jQuery will not show up in this, like who did not have to write an event prevent default at one point. Yeah, like no one, right? So there was a constant. When you write jQuery, there was always, okay, first line event prevent default, and then do your magic code. Like that's also the thing that's like baked into Vue like super nicely. So here we have the anchor tag, and we're just like, okay, click, and then we do .prevent, and it's done for us. We don't have to write it all over again. And the same works for stop propagation. You can just say .stop, and then it's like stopping there as well. So it kind of lives where you actually bind your events, and it's like super easy to digest and read. So that's what kind of I really liked in the beginning. Another very common example that you stumble on very often is like the bread and butter of today is like rendering lists of any kind of data. And that was also for us, of course, the case. And that's also quite straightforward in Vue. So if you use the v4 attribute, that allows you kind of to iterate over lists. That can be an array, can be an object. I think with the new version it can be like sets and maps even. So a lot of things you could do. And again, we use the curly braces to print something out. And now we render like a list item for each element in our data set. So yeah, that's super exciting. But it's like very straightforward. We already see, okay, that's kind of what I suggest, and then like it's working this way. So it's nice. But we say we want to progress our way through it, so maybe we don't want to use like plain HTML anymore. We want to use components. And here we wrote a super simple component called user. And excuse my inline string template, maybe not the prettiest version or so, but it kind of solves the issue for now. And we just take a list item again, and then we iterate over the user. And we already see like using components inside Vue is also pretty painless. And one thing that you might see here is like the slot. And that kind of so super odd. Like, what's a slot, basically? What does this do? And I will talk a little bit more about slots a little later, so keep your eyes out for it. The other thing that I constantly need to do when working with components is like passing in properties. Might sound familiar to anybody who's kind of worked with React, where properties are like kind of also super part of the core fundamentals, how you work with components. It's like just how you pass something down. So if you have any kind of value, and when you tell you component below it, just pass it down. You're very like pragmatic, very, you just like use this in syntax and then show it, okay, this is where I bind it and this is what I pass down, to have a very clear API basically for your components, what they're going to use. So how props look like in Vue is you just use your Vue instance and you use a key called props. And here the simplest way is you use an array and say, okay, I expect something called name, I expect something ID. And then Vue, again, like does the magic for you when it's initiated. It's all bound to the Vue instance, so you can reference it with this.name, this.id, and whatever you want to do. If you don't like this approach too much, that's fair. The next thing we could do, we can just extend our props and make it kind of like a little more powerful by doing some kind of validation and requirements, basically. And here we can say name should be a string and ID should also be a string. So Vue, in this case, would already like scream at you and say if you pass anything else down, for example. The component, how it could look like, is we pass something down, like the Bruce Wayne as the name, and then the ID, like what comes from a random ID. And the big difference here is, like the first thing we already see is like name. It's just like how we write any HTML attribute. And Vue on a component just takes it as a property, and anything that's in there is automatically transpiled to a string or a number if you want to be explicit about it. But the interesting part is that vbind. What does vbind actually do? And to get this done, like Vue tries to say, okay, you want to bind something, so I'm going to look on my instance what you referenced there. And for example, random ID could come again from the data, and it's like maybe something that's evaluated coming from a function and initiated in runtime. So we want to bind it there. Again, Vue tries to make this experience very pleasantly. So if you don't want to write vbind all the time, you can just omit it and just say like the :ID. And at this point, it like already gets like super nice and readable, and it's kind of very easy to mark out, okay, what are the bind ones, what are the default ones, and Vue just tries to be as small in its API and layer as necessary, but as descriptive as kind of needed. The other thing that we could do is, like, if we have a component, for example, a modal, we can even do like, okay, we can break the props down even further and say we accept like a type that could be either a string or a number, and can even assign defaults. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with properties. And we could also say, okay, action, for example, should be a function. And that sounds probably super familiar to anybody from the React background, where it's kind of used to passing down callback functions through properties. While it's possible in Vue, it's not really widely used, and that's kind of like the way how you would write Vue components. But it's possible. If you want to do it, pass down functions, that's also super good, an opportunity to do so. The other thing that I really liked about Vue was I got reactivity for free. Like, I never really kind of like knew exactly what is reactivity, what does it mean. Like, I started to look a little bit deeper into RxJS and say, okay, data is kind of reacting to something. React, of course, has the name of React, but what does reactivity mean actually? And that was like just nice to see how easy it is to integrate and get anything kind of data reactive for you. So we could bind a state, like just a simple object, and whenever we bind it in Vue, reference the state, this state is getting like reactive for you. Like what Vue does underneath, like it binds it. So when you use it, you could say VM count. That's like just in count is bound to the instance again. And if I reference it, I get, of course, the number 1. But then I could like update this state and say, okay, hey, update anything there. But because it's reactive, if I call VM count again, it would be automatically upgraded to number 2. So it creates this definition and combination between like those 2 elements. And the way Vue does it is using object-defined property. Who here has never heard of object-defined property? Almost everybody knows it. Okay, that's awesome. For me, that was like super interesting to learn about it. To just say, okay, like you can bind something, use the set, and you get this for free. Like there's a lot of things underneath it to kind of be able to bind all this kind of data between. And yeah, that's how Vue does it underneath. If you don't like this implicit reactivity that you get from the previous example, since Vue 2.6 was dropped, I think, about a month or 2 months ago, you can now use like Vue.observable to create an observable object that does the same for you, but you're a little bit more explicit. And this is done in preparation for Vue 3 that's dropping sometime this year, where you also can use the observable and get like this reactivity. But yeah, I think you might have heard in the previous talk that it's coming and that it's kind of Vue's kind of switching to proxies, but yeah, let's talk about this a little later. The next thing, when we talk about reactivity, what I love crazy about Vue, by now, like whenever I touch a new library or framework, this is the first thing I was looking for is like something like computed properties. If you don't know what a computed property is, if you've never heard of it, it's basically a function that returns like a set of data, but it only reevaluates when anything of the dependency actually changes. Sounds super complicated. It's basically not. It's like just simple functions that reevaluate if anything kind of is tracked. But the way you can use it in Vue is like just so seamless and nice, and you get like a ton of like benefits out of it. That's a super simple example, of course. Like we have our numbers, and in this case, we want to have the even numbers whenever the data set changes. So if I have evens, and it kind of keeps track of the numbers, then we'll always return, like in this case, 2 and 4. And it will just reevaluate if I push a new number to the array. But then as soon as I call evens again, I will get like a new result. If I call it over and over and over again without the data set changing, then Vue also does cache those values for you. So that's the nice way. You could do like very heavy functions in there that do a ton of things. Like they will just reevaluate if they really must to. The process of like caching it, you call it very often memoizing. Like not memorizing, but memoizing. What's like a super fancy term for caching it for you. Yeah, that's just one thing you need to be aware of. It can be a huge benefit, but it's also a very early trap sometimes. For example, if you use a computed property to define a value, in this case we want to have a new date, and whenever I call like now, I want to have like the new date, that's not how it's working. Like I said, it will cache it. And in this case, there's no dependency to track for Vue. So what it does, it reevaluates it once, puts it there, and whenever you call it, you basically get the value that Vue had generated for you the first time it was initiated. So that's the common gotcha. Another example to maybe kind of make it a little bit more appealing is here we have like a new Vue instance, and here we use a created function. Created is one of Vue's lifecycle methods. So the nice thing of Vue, it gives you different kind of entry points with like some magic function names like created or mounted or updated. That allows you basically to fire a function at any point when you really need to. You can even do cool things like before destroy or the destroy. If you want to kind of set anything to the server, show alerts, this kind of stuff, you can easily put in those lifecycle functions and can really enrich the experience of your components. But yeah, what we do here is we use created, and we set an interval and just say, okay, every second, count up by 1. Not too exciting. But about the computed property, what it's doing for us is like it sets, and now it keeps track of this counter. So this means like when every second, basically, I now would get a console log telling me, okay, like now it's 1 second passed, 2 seconds passed, 3 seconds passed. It's like I don't have to do anything. Like the computed property is keeping track of everything and does it for me. I guess a few of you with my scream internally say, oh, that sounds like a performance issue and an easy trap. Luckily, Vue is pretty smart about how it does like those updates and when it fires which events. So kind of like it happens asynchronously, and Vue collects, if you change a lot of data at once, Vue will kind of batch them together, see, okay, what's the easiest logic to get like all the things reevaluated without kind of running into a loop, and then it does it for you. But the nice thing is you don't have to think about it too much. Like Vue does this for you. Mixins. If you have not heard yet of mixins, mixins also quite nice actually. They're just allowing you to create some set of like functions, whatever you want to do, like a shared piece of code. They say explicitly, I have my Vue code and I have this mixin prepared for example, for the user, and I want to just spread it into my Vue instance or my component or wherever I want to use it. And I can be very explicit about it, say mixins, use this one here. Then Vue uses a nice like merging strategy. So even if you have like two created or updated functions, it will always run the core one first and then the one from the mixin. So there's a very clear path how the merging strategy works. And usually there's no conflict. So that works super, super nice. I know there was always like the conversation, do we need mixins? Are they useful or not? Like luckily in Vue they come for free and they're almost like no code at all. So you can use it or not. I don't see so much spreading of mixins. At one point, I kind of consulted on one project that was using mixins like everywhere, and that was like horrible. So just, if you want to use them, just use them like with care and say, okay, I really explicitly want to kind of mix something in. What you can do as well is just say vue.mixin and put something in there. This will then apply it globally, so every new Vue instance will kind of share these pieces of code. So if you want to do this, it's a good way of like really being able to kind of hijack or inject any kind of logic very fast, but just be aware that it's happening. So use it with care and caution. The better way might be something like plugins. Plugins are, I would say, similar to mixins, but they just give you way more control over what's happening, and you can like pass in any kind of like options or so. So you have a lot of control of what you want to do eventually there. So for example, let's create a new user plugin, super fancy, and we use our mixin that we have created already. So what we could do is we provide it, and there's an install method what gets the Vue instance, and then we can take some options. So that's something that mixins themselves cannot do. They can't say like react to any kind of options if a user wants to use it. But a plugin, of course, can say, I'll take your options. I can like do any kind of merge strategy for you or react to different changes, what parts you want or so. So that gives you a lot of freedom. And what we could do, for example, is also to bind functions to the prototype of Vue, like a logout function. That's super handy sometimes, especially on very security-heavy apps, maybe, for example, on a banking stuff. When you never know on which page you are, you could always, like in worst case scenario, just like call this.$logout, and it will immediately find a function. So if you want to be sure that you have control over sessions and this kind of stuff, that's like a super easy way where you're not bound to any kind of like asynchronous things or that it kind of might be tricked. So that's quite nice, actually. And the way to use a plugin is just say Vue use, and then you put in the plugin, and that's it. And you can spread in the options next. One of the heavier plugins, and we touched on it briefly already, is like Vuex. What's the state management library? And it's installed in the same way. You just say Vue use Vuex, and then this gives you a lot of opportunities or benefits of binding Vuex and kind of making some of the reactivity work between like the state and your components, all that kind of things. So that's nice. And I talked a lot so far, so let's take a deep breath. You're all still with me? All good? Yeah? Time for a dramatic drinking pause. Did you know there's a book called Dancing with Cats? That's like super weird. Like I stumbled over it a few years ago, and it like haunts me for some reason. There's like super weird pictures in there, and like people dressed up as kind of like cats guys, and like it haunts me, and now you know that this book exists, so it will haunt you as well. So you're welcome. But yeah, let's go back to Vue. Another thing that's really, really cool about Vue is Vue single file components. Has anybody heard of single file components? Okay, a few. So single file components are the most awesome thing I ever stumbled over, and I really adore them to death. The only downside is you probably need some kind of like build process in your project. While so far we have been able to easily drop in script tags and even could like on the page write all our Vue magic code. If you want to start like using Vue single file components, there must be some kind of like compilation phase first. So if we use something like Webpack or Parcel or Poi, what's like a kind of like a build system out of the Vue ecosystem. I'm not sure how widespread it is, but it's like nice, it gets you going if you want to try out something. But you need some kind of like compilation. So a single file component, just think about, for a component, I mostly have to define my template. How's my template looking? At one point, I have to define the script. What should actually happen there? And maybe I want to even like apply some styles. And maybe I want to kind of like use different kind of languages and this kind of stuff. Now imagine like, don't keep track of those in all different files. Like you could have like one file that has like those 3 sections kind of carved out for you. So you have all the logic kind of like in one place. Like your template, your script, your styles if you want to. That's super, super nice. I really love it. And you have those .vue files, and VS Code has amazing like syntax highlighting for it, so it just feels nice. And you could even like on the script tag define the language that you want to use. So if you want to use like something like CoffeeScript or TypeScript or whatever, like Vue will then, or the Vue single file components can correctly highlight those for you. So you can compose them in any way that you like, and use even like Sass, Less, whatever like is your preferred styling language. So that's quite nice actually. A more realistic example how some of them might look like at one point is like I can even import like other single file components, kind of define them here, kind of pass down collections, this kind of stuff. So that's how it might look like somewhere in the code base. But it's just incredibly nice to have like those two kind of like separated, but still in the same file. That's super handy. But you might ask now, okay, is it all that easy? Like so far it's like all super demo-y kind of content, and yeah, is it that easy actually in production? Let's go back to this short example that we had, where we say, okay, we can drop it onto one page. Luckily, it kind of is that easy actually. The only thing I omitted in most of the examples so far that you might have seen is like this little app thing, or like the element reference. That's basically the necessary Vue entry point that you say, okay, hook in here, and everything else like you're about to control. But that's about it, and that's like how easy it is. So in a real project, it might look something like this. This is even like a very simplified and cleaned out example from our production code, like very cleaned out, of course. But you can think about if you have anything like a system running on whatever kind of thing based, like whatever language, if you're able to compile HTML, then you're able to use like your Vue just on the page where you want to. So all you need to do is maybe like drop in your compiled Vue version. That's like having all the important code, the components there, and it references maybe the app again and say, that's my entry point. And now, as the Vue code already knows about something called user list, it is able to say, oh, there's a component on there, and I know about this component, so let me replace this for you. And in this case even, the thing that looks super weird, like this hash with the curly braces, that's like really from Ruby on Rails, where it says, okay, this is how I can string something. And in this case, it takes the data set we already had on the page, for example. Because before it was like just a plain, simple rendered Ruby page. And now we want to make the user list, for example, way more kind of interactive and maybe enhance it with a lot of actions. So we just take the data because it was already on the page, and we don't have to do like magic AJAX requests to finally get the data that we're rendering there. We have it on the page, let's take it, and Vue's then even able to pick it up from your kind of rendered source code and just kind of put it in place there. So that's incredibly nice. And if that sounds interesting to you, I have a complete other talk on this topic. That's like how to integrate Vue into an existing stack. But the gist of it is basically, you can really start making very clean and easy cuts to say where are the parts that I want to inject Vue into my application, start to enrich it, and where I maybe kind of still serve my old code there. And that's just something I didn't see from any other system so far, like this easy and this seamless. And like we have to deploy constantly, like we do maybe 20, 30 deploys a day of like really production code. And for us even to be able to kind of move this fast, that was like super, super awesome. So while we talk about templates a lot, there's another cool thing, and it's also maybe is familiar for some of you. Those are render functions. And you can use render functions alongside Vue as well. If you hate the template syntax so far, yeah, you can use render functions. How a render function looks like, basically, you define it directly on the Vue script and say, okay, you get like a function that's called createElement, and then you create your span tag with like some text in there, and that does it for you, and it mounts it correctly, and everything else is done. This is like writing the template, but of course here it's now in this createElement syntax. If createElement sounds kind of like odd, you could also call it like H. And maybe H sounds familiar to anybody who has ever worked with JSX. Like there it's more kind of common. And I learned one day that H stands for hyperscript. And hyperscript because it's like use JavaScript to generate hypertext and like HTML. And so yeah, that was interesting too. Why do you call it H? But yeah. If you want a more like a hands-on example, okay, how does this really look like? That's, for example, a component or some kind of HTML that I try to render here with a header, and then I use this P where I say, okay, if a message is given, and if none is given, like it should render the other one. Maybe another thing that you enhance by just looking at this piece of code is, oh, the v-if, v-else, like I don't have to know anything about Vue to understand what's going on here. And that's kind of one of the other things I really like about Vue, how easy and to digest it is. Like you say, that was kind of what I was expecting. And that's how Vue tries to work. Like it tries to get your developer experience, try to work in the way that you expect it to work, and almost always goes this way. What's super, super exciting. But yeah, as a render function, this might look something like this. Or say, okay, we do this h, diff, and header, and kind of, that's super unreadable, so don't write it in render functions if you want to have like this simple piece of code. Like your template is way more easy to digest than this piece of code down there. And the good thing is, with like simple templates, like Vue is way smarter than we could ever be. Like Vue generates this kind of stuff out of it. It like says, okay, ooh, I need to kind of render all the elements for you, so it can statically analyze it. Is there like a static content in there? Is there anything that I need to track? So that's why it split it up, for example, and takes the whole header with ITkonekt. That's a string it just need to render once, so I kind of put it in an extra function, so it's just faster if I need to reevaluate anything. Like Vue can be super, super smart about this. And this is like the benefits you get of like this pre-compiling of your code, like with something like Webpack and templates. So that's super exciting. But a good use case for render functions could, for example, sometimes something be where you say templates cannot kind of like do it or kind of like define your code in the way that you want to. Like having a heading component that says it should be kind of dynamic and decide if it's an H1 or an H2. Like good luck writing like a template with a ton of v-ifs or so. That's like super, super annoying. Like that's where something like a render function totally shines. We could use a prop says, I take a level property, what's a number, and by default it will always be a 1. And then my render function, I can dynamically generate what's the tag that I want to have. So I can have like a H1 and potentially I can have a H99 if I want to. But yeah, it just takes, okay, the tag is dynamically generated. It takes the slot again and puts it in there. And that's how easy. And that's a good use case for render functions. But there's this thing again, like slots. What does it do? And we said we're going to talk about it. So let's briefly talk about slots. So slots are basically placeholders with superpowers. Like, I really love slots. A simple example that it kind of very much changed in how I'm writing certain components, how I'm able to kind of write reusable parts of my application. And what it could do is like, let's say a modal that like pops up on your screen, and always like there's never the solution, okay, this is the modal I'm using across everywhere in the application. There's always, oh, this page is a little different, this is a little different, here I want to have like some extras. And slots are perfect for doing this. Like we could define one where I say, okay, there's a slot for the header, what's like this headline on top, there's like a one for the main content, and maybe one for the footer section where it kind of has all your actions and this kind of stuff. The way that you can start using it is whenever I start to use the modal component actually, I can define a template here and say, okay, you go in the header slot. Then the main content always goes into the default slot, and the other one goes into the footer slot. So that's how easy you can start like enriching your modal, and I don't have to rewrite the logic all the time. It's like using one template. I can use it in like a bazillion different ways now by using the slot. So that's super, super handy. So there's one thing on there that's kind of making it possible. If you go on the view instance, there's like something like this.scoped slots. And what's underneath there is kind of like a object that has all like the default stuff or the header one or the footer one, like whatever you have passed in, this is what Vue gives you access to. So if you want to have like programmatic access on what's the data that's coming in, this is where you have it. But the other cool thing is what this knowledge allows us to do is to even go a step further and create something called renderless components. That sounds cool. Honestly, at the first I had no idea what should I do with renderless components. Like I always want to render something. But yeah, I very often know what I want to do, and maybe a component should just enrich like some logic for me and don't just wrap it into an extra div tag. Like then I have like those 20 different div tags because I kind of want to put some logic in there. I want to have something that's truly renderless that just takes what I get and then kind of puts it on a screen. This is what you can do with slots. So let's have something like a randomizer which says, okay, I want to have like any kind of number here. And all it does, it creates a number, what's its main logic. But then we look at the render function, and there's like no element that we actually create. All we do is just we return the default slot, so everything that's in there, and then we can pass some data along. So in the code, how we could use it potentially is just say, okay, randomizer. Then off the default slot, I pick the number using object extraction of JavaScript, and then I put it on page. And my rendered HTML will actually just show the span with this number in here. So that's like super nice to enrich parts of your code kind of with logic without kind of generating a lot of unnecessary markup on top of this. And again, Vue tries to make it a little more seamless, a little nicer, and especially as slots get more and more powerful and by now are like super, super useful, what you do now, you can use the hash instead of the vslot syntax. And that's quite nice. But just be aware, this just dropped with Vue 2.6. So if you're an older version, this might not work. But Vue 2.6 and upwards on version 3, this will be the main syntax of how you can interact with slots and all this kind of stuff. To give you a real-world example, this is from our application. So what you see here is like this is full use of a renderless component. Well, like the whole dropdown, all this kind of stuff gets generated actually on our server by the Rails application. And I don't want to like duplicate all the routing and all this kind of stuff in the client. I just want to enrich it with like some power. And this little green bubble that you see on top there, that's basically making an API call to status page and says, okay, what's the status of my current page? Is everything operational? Is there anything I should know about? And then we just print it into the dropdown for the user, easy to digest. And that's like super nice. Like that's a super good use case where I say, I just want to have some kind of like functionality. And worst case is like if the API calls fails or so and is not enriching the data correctly, like my component is not crashing, like the content is still there for the user, so it can still interact with everything, but the green bubble is might not there. So that's worst case. How this code would look like in production is something like this. You don't have to read and understand every line now, but basically we could use create it again, do an AJAX request to the status page, get this one, and then on the render part, what's interesting, whoops, up here, right? That's where we then actually take the status class that we want to use and the description, and then we put it onto the markup. And the markup here, if that sounds looks kind of odd, that's Slim. What's like a template language that just allows you to omit like all the tags and this kind of stuff. It's like a very straightforward, similar to Jade or Pug. And yeah, that's how we write it. And all we do here is, again, like to use the slot scope. We extract description and status class. Here we bind it directly to the class. And down there is the description where it's actually on the page. And that's all that's happening. The rest is all coming from the server. So that's like super, super nice and very fast to develop. The other thing that you can do with Vue is starting to wrap a library. Okay, is this useful? Is it necessary? Well, one thing that I stumbled over, like once you start to go down in any kind of like a component system, like the worst case if you want to enrich something with a library that suddenly requires a DOM node on a page. Like good luck finding this one. Is it there when I initiate the code? Like this kind of stuff. It's always super annoying to find the correct DOM nodes, inject any kind of thing. Why not start wrapping this library easily so it's kind of presented as a component for the rest of my code, and I can programmatically use it wherever I want to without explicitly adding it on a page every single time. So first of all, like Vue started to replace like so many different libraries for me. It's like just so nice how everything is incorporated, and for a lot of things I don't even need to wrap anything, but Vue comes with those things along and prepared. For example, a pops up was like publish, subscribe events, this kind of stuff. Like Vue comes with an event system already, so why not initiate an empty Vue instance, go for it, put it on the page, and suddenly you have a global pops up event. Like you use Vue already, don't need an extra library. That's super handy. But what if we want to wrap something like simple bar, that's like a custom scroll bar that we can use on the page? We just want to use the one from the CDN again. Like I want to have it like as simple as possible. I do not want to load it manually every single time. So all I need to know is how simple bar wants to be initiated. It says, okay, document, give me any kind of like DOM node, pass in some options. Here you go, that's simple bar for you. So what we could do in Vue, we just create a new template. And here we use something called ref. It's a reference to a DOM node that we can use afterwards. And again, the slot, cool. But our magic text for wrapping this library is I can even take the CSS link and the JavaScript link directly from the CDN. And in my mounted function, what I try to do is I dynamically create the link tag. I dynamically create the script tag, append it to the head, and now it's loading for me. So I don't need to load the libraries manually every time. And the simplest trick I found to work to say is like something loading, like to prevent any kind of like errors. I can just wait for simple bar to actually be loaded because it's asynchronous. Worst case is it kind of takes some time because I download a ton of other kind of different assets right now. Just wait for it till it's there, and every 100 milliseconds, which is it there, is it there? And once it is, we call a setup method. So what will our setup method do is let's define a data set with the instance and make it a configuration. And the setup method that we want to call is just do something, okay, let's remember the instance. And again, we can use the same code that SimpleBar wants us to use by saying, okay, we reference actually our wrapper element that we had in the HTML tag. So now we know which DOM node is there. We don't need to document query select or anything. Like we have a very hard reference to this one. And whenever it's destroyed, we can easily reinitiate it this way. That's super, super handy. Yeah. Clean state management is also something I want to breeze over this to don't kind of bore you to death on this one. But luckily it's just as easy as all the rest. Like so far it's all quite nice, a simple API, can do a lot of powerful things. To give you a short glimpse of how Vuex looks like, and Vuex is a Redux-like Flux orientation-based state management. So again, you use like a state, maybe mutations, actions. That might sound super familiar from any other state management library. But why it's so nice to work it with Vue, and again, to come back to this narrative coherence here, is we can use like something like map getters, map actions. Those are like little functions I can use to spread like those bindings into my Vue instance. And suddenly I have this connection, and I can use the getters, what I just computed properties underneath. And like I get all this binding between like state, and it's like super seamless and very easy to integrate. And we're running this kind of like structure and architecture at scale, and so far like no problem. So it's really like super nice to develop, and we have a team now of kind of many front-end engineers actually working on it. And like it's just easy how it works, and everybody can come along with it. And just recently we had a super interesting conversation on Twitter, and somebody put it this way, where it's okay, like what makes Vue awesome is basically it has a set of conventions that you kind of should know and follow to a certain degree, but otherwise it is like extremely developer friendly, and that kind of makes it like so easy and so powerful. Like, what about testing? Like, I'm coming from a testing background. Maybe I should throw testing in here. Like, it is important. Whenever you write code, you need to know how to test your code. But I think we don't have time for this anymore. So just know there's like also, again, something for you prepared. It's called the Vue test utils. It's also maintained by the Vue core team, so it's always working with Vue. And just use something like Jest on top of it, and the testing experience is super easy and super great. And if this is interesting to you, I also have a talk of this on YouTube, so just Google it and you'll find it. But the cool thing about the Vue ecosystem so far is like, there's like so many things out there, and it kind of like Vue brings everything to the table that you need. Like, it's kind of all maintained by the core team even. Like Vuex, Vue Router, the Vue test utils. This is actually really the Vue core team that's kind of like maintains it. So whenever there's a new version of Vue dropped, it's always kind of guaranteed to work with all the other tools. So it's always tested, and that's kind of like makes it so nice. I've been to like other teams in our company, like, oh, a new React version dropped, we want to use it, suddenly Redux is not on par. Oh, we have to wait another like 2 weeks or a week till Redux is fixed and is kind of like digestible with the new version. So this like constantly happens there. For Vue, it's like just always guaranteed to happen, and this is like so nice. So there's like so much praise out there for the Vue ecosystem by now, and it's just incredibly cool. And I have to say, by this point, like Vue is incredibly mature. Like I still know when I talk to a few people, it is like, oh, Vue is kind of like the underdog. It's like the kind of the cheap version of React or so. It's absolutely not. It's kind of like really, it's kind of arrived at main stage. There's like a ton of people using it, a lot of products using it. It's like, I think by now, like the most used JavaScript library, I think, in China. Like Alibaba is using it. So there's a ton of like really big companies investing in it and using it. Like even like your friends out there from Unity Cloud, I think Unity Cloud, they have like this awesome TV station, and that's a UI that's completely written in Vue. Like you have this seamless kind of zapping between channels and rooms. The animations look amazing, and that's done with Vue. Like they even tried to verify other technologies, but Vue was like just simple to get it running and smooth animations, and that's super exciting. That gets me exciting about a JavaScript framework. Evan Yu, the original creator of Vue, just kind of posted this like I think 3 days ago. There was another like survey on Stack Overflow, and for people like who are like about what they love and this kind of stuff, like Vue is now on second point behind React. Like this was unexpected. Like 1 year ago, Vue was not even on this list. And today it's like the second one behind React above all the other systems that have been out there for way longer. So it's kind of like really picking up steam by a lot. And of course, Vue 3 is coming this year. That's exciting. Like there's so much cool things coming our way. Vue is going to be faster, lighter. It's like just tries to make it more developer friendly, more easier. Like you don't have to care for performance. Like Vue does this for you. If you just stick to the conventions, it's like super easy to have a crazy performant page. The biggest change is probably the reactivity changes, and you heard this, I think, in the previous talk, where now we're using proxies. This gives us also a new set of awesome, cool features that we could use with proxies that we can't do with object observed property, defined property, sorry. But that's coming. That's super awesome. TypeScript, like who's excited for TypeScript? Yeah, the TypeScript good. Awesome. Vue's now, the core of V3 is completely rewritten in TypeScript. And while Vue started to kind of add a lot of good TypeScript support with version 2.4, I think, now version 3 is fully supporting TypeScript, going all in. And that guy gives us, as developers, again, an amazing developer experience. And that's super, super cool. If you want to hear more about this, there's a good Medium blog post from Greg Pollack that kind of puts everything like into perspective, and that's cool. And from my experience, again, like on a company side, like we adopted it at 0.11, and now we're kind of on the latest version. Like the upgrade process was incredibly painless so far. Like there was no, oh my God, what should I do? It was always easy for me to get up to date. And one question I always get asked after the talk, well, today, with everything that you know, would you choose Vue again? I absolutely would. I absolutely would. Just in this one conversation I had recently, like, I don't want to judge on anything here, like, okay, but like this is, if I look at code, I just know which one I like better, what's kind of easier to understand for me, and it kind of like, from my experience so far, it's also easier to scale it in teams. Like, imagine if it's more complex or so, like Vue kind of tries to wrap it in a very, very simple way. And I think I really have to speed up, But yeah, that was kind of my inflammatory kind of Twitter conversation that happened or so. But yeah, from my experience, like I look at a lot of different projects, and in the React world, even I looked at 10 different React projects, and everybody does it differently. Like it's super hard for the people to switch from one team to the other. Like we are using Redux, the other team is using MobX, the other one using like anything else. Like Vue is just like all the projects look very, very similar because it has a certain set of conventions, what makes it very easy to replicate and kind of even have teams switching from one point to the other. So the question, does it make sense for business to invest in Vue? From my point, absolutely, and for our team, it paid off incredibly. That's a picture of the black hole. I'm just amazed that this is possible, what is super exciting. Yeah, if you want to know more about Vue, I worked a little bit with Vue School. I put some videos up there. That's a short link you can use to get a 20% off discount. Yeah, I don't know how long it's active or so, but that's good. Otherwise, thank you for listening.